They called me a rounding error in their empire, but they didn't realize that the woman standing in the lobby with a latte was the same one holding the kill switch for their entire life's work. By the time they realized I wasn't there for a job interview, it was already too late to stop the internal investigation that would tear their corrupt world to pieces. I have always believed that arrogance is a brittle armor. It protects nothing, it only makes the target larger. I was standing in the lobby of the Sterling Vance headquarters, holding a modest cardboard box and a lukewarm latte, when I first encountered Marcus Thorne. He was the kind of man who draped himself in bespoke suits like they were royal robes, his jaw perpetually set in a sneer that suggested the air he breathed was somehow inferior to his lungs. I was there for a final consultation, a high-stakes meeting that would decide the future of the firm's algorithmic infrastructure. I was dressed in a tailored navy blazer and slim-fit trousers, understated, professional, and entirely invisible to someone like Marcus. As I waited for the elevator, he strode past me, flanked by his usual gaggle of sycophants, his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't even glance at me, but when he realized the elevator was waiting for him, he stopped and looked me up and down with an expression of profound boredom. "Delivery entrance is around the back, sweetheart," he drawled, not even breaking his stride. "We don't take unsolicited pitches from catering staff in the main lobby." I didn't blink. I've heard variations of that sentence my entire life, usually from men who think their net worth is a substitute for personality. "I'm not here for catering," I replied, my voice calm, steady, and devoid of the deference he clearly expected. He stopped then, turning fully toward me. His eyes were cold, scanning my face as if searching for a reason to have me removed. "Oh? Then what exactly is your function here? Janitorial? Maintenance? Maybe you're just lost and looking for a way to climb the social ladder through the service stairs?" His voice rose, loud enough for the reception desk to go deathly silent. "Security. Why is there someone blocking the foyer? Get her out before she scuffs the marble." A guard stepped forward, looking pained. He knew exactly who I was, but Marcus was the man who signed the building's checks, and he played the role of the neighborhood king with terrifying commitment. I reached into my bag and pulled out my tablet, tapping a single icon. "Mr. Thorne," I said, stepping into the elevator as the doors began to slide open. "It's fascinating that you think so little of the people who make your empire function. But then again, arrogance has always been the hallmark of those who don't actually understand how their own business makes money." He laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed in the high ceilings. "Honey, I built this building. I don't need to understand the mechanics of the code to know that a woman like you is a rounding error in my profit margins. You're lucky I don't have you blacklisted from every corporate campus in the city." I looked at him, feeling a sudden, sharp clarity. This wasn't just about a bad day or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was the man who had been sabotaging the diversity initiatives I'd been working on for 6 months. He was the one who kept pushing for the implementation of a proprietary software that was deeply flawed, likely to hide the fact that he was funneling company assets into a private, unregulated, organized scheme. "You should be careful," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Some people spend their lives building an image of wealth, only to realize that their foundation is made of sand. And when the service of internal security comes knocking, they usually aren't interested in your suits." His face flushed, a deep, ugly red. "Are you threatening me? Who do you think you are?" "I'm the person who is about to make sure that the board realizes exactly what you've been doing with the offshore accounts," I whispered, stepping inside the lift. I hit the button for the penthouse, the private boardroom floor. He stepped in with me, livid. "You're delusional. You're a nobody. You're probably making $60,000 a year and think you're in a position to challenge me? I make more in a minute than you will in your entire pathetic existence." I watched him as the elevator ascended, the digital display glowing in the dim light. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen once, activating the real-time financial tracking dashboard that I had spent the last 2 years developing. The screen reflected in the glass, a cascading stream of data that showed not just his assets, but the red flags of the illegal activity he tried to hide. "Mr. Thorne," I said, as the lift dinged at the top floor, "you're right about one thing. We don't make the same amount of money. My compensation package for this consultancy firm, which by the way owns the patent to the very software you're trying to sell, is exactly 3 times your current CEO salary. And as of 5 minutes ago, you're not just looking at a board review. You're looking at an internal investigation that won't end until every single penny of your fraudulent gains is accounted for." He laughed again, but this time it sounded strained. "You're bluffing. You're a nobody. You're going to be sued into oblivion for this." The elevator doors opened, and there stood 3 men in charcoal gray suits, holding folders with the seal of the board of directors. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at Marcus. "Mr. Thorne," the lead agent said, his voice cold, "we've been authorized to begin a formal audit of your private accounts. We've found evidence of an organized scheme involving prohibited offshore transfers and suspected mishandling of high-value assets. You're coming with us." Marcus turned pale, his jaw dropping. He looked at me, then at the men, his arrogance fracturing like glass. I stepped out, adjusted my blazer, and didn't even look back. But as I walked toward the boardroom, I heard him scream, "You're finished! I'll make sure you never work again!" I didn't need to look back to know he was wrong, because as the board members turned to greet me, one of them handed me a pen. They weren't here to fire me. They were here to hand me his chair. And that was when I heard the heavy click of the elevator door locking behind him. Not from the outside, but from the inside, as the security team began the process of cutting him off from the system entirely. But then, my phone buzzed in my hand with a message from an anonymous number. "He knows it was you, and he's not going down alone." The message screen glowed in the dim light of the penthouse corridor, the words burning themselves into my retinas. "He knows it was you, and he's not going down alone." I didn't stop walking. To stop would have been to acknowledge the tremor that had just flickered through my hands. Instead, I pressed the phone into my palm and let out a long, slow breath. I had been preparing for this day for 24 months, collecting data, tracing the digital breadcrumbs, and securing the evidence that proved Marcus Thorne was not just an arrogant egomaniac, but a man running a massive, organized scheme behind the curtain of his billionaire lifestyle. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a blade. The long mahogany table was occupied by 6 board members, all of whom had been blinded by Marcus's charisma for far too long. They looked up as I entered, and for a moment, the silence was absolute. These were people who viewed the world in terms of quarterly reports and stock prices. They hadn't yet fully processed that the man who had been the face of their brand for a decade was currently being escorted to a secure room by the internal security team. "Ms. Vaughn," the chairman said, standing up. His face was etched with exhaustion. "We've reviewed the primary ledger you uploaded. If even half of this is accurate, Marcus has effectively compromised our standing with the Regulatory Commission." I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, Marcus's chair, and sat down. I didn't apologize for it. "It's not half, Mr. Chairman, it's all of it. I've traced the prohibited financial flows and the offshore accounts that have been masquerading as consultancy fees. He hasn't just been stealing, he's been laundering funds under the guise of an organized structure that he thought was invisible to the service of internal security." I watched their expressions shift from skepticism to cold, hard realization. I wasn't just a consultant anymore. I was the person who had handed them the rope they were now using to hang their golden boy. "What happens now?" one of the members asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Now," I said, opening my tablet to display the flow of the assets, "we initiate the audit. We freeze the accounts before he can trigger the emergency transfer protocols he's set up to funnel the money into untraceable holdings. If we move within the next 10 minutes, we recover the majority of the firm's stolen capital." As I spoke, the internal security team filed into the room. They weren't looking at the board members, they were looking at me. The lead guard, a man named Henderson, approached the table. He leaned in, his voice low and professional. "Ms. Vaughn, we've secured Mr. Thorne in the holding suite, but we encountered a problem. His private terminal was being accessed remotely even after we cut his credentials. Someone is trying to wipe the server logs." My stomach dropped. I had anticipated many things, but I hadn't expected him to have a dead man's switch active. "I can block it from here," I said, my fingers flying across the touchscreen. "I have the administrative override codes." "It's not just a wipe," Henderson continued, his eyes darkening. "We found something else in his office, a series of encrypted drives hidden behind the wall safe. We also found a list of names, and yours is at the top, highlighted in red. He isn't just looking for an exit strategy. He's looking for a way to ensure that whoever brought him down doesn't survive to see the trial." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The anonymous text message wasn't just a threat from an associate, it was a warning that the organized scheme he'd been running was far more dangerous than simple financial fraud. It was a web of leverage, blackmail, and illegal influence that touched corners of the city I had naively thought were beyond his reach. "Get the board members out of here," I commanded, my voice firm. If he's triggered a wipe, the security protocols might be failing across the entire building. If this system goes down, the backup servers in the basement will be the only thing keeping the data intact. I can't take you with me, Ms. Vaughn, Henderson said, placing a hand on the back of my chair. It's too dangerous. We need to get you to an off-site facility until the internal investigation clears the building. If I leave, he wins, I snapped, standing up. If those servers go offline, he walks away with millions in untraceable assets, and the evidence against him disappears. I'm the only one who knows how to reroute the power to the secondary backup. I looked at the board members, who were frozen in a mix of panic and confusion. I need you to sign these documents, I said, sliding the digital transfer request toward them. It authorizes me to take control of the digital infrastructure. Now, unless you want the company to collapse within the hour. They scrambled to sign, their hands shaking as they tapped the glass. As soon as the final signature was confirmed, a wave of green light washed over the room. The system was mine, but as I took full control, a notification popped up on the main screen. A location tag for the basement server room. It wasn't a system error. It was a live feed from the basement, and it showed a man in a black tactical vest standing in front of the server racks, holding a device that looked suspiciously like a hardware bypass. Marcus hadn't just tried to wipe the system. He had sent someone to physically destroy it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the screen again, focusing on the man's face. He turned toward the camera and he smiled. A cold, calculated grin that felt like a predator looking directly at me through the lens. He held up a second device, a detonator. He's not just going to destroy the data, I realized, the blood draining from my face. He's going to collapse the entire floor of the building. I turned to Henderson, who was already pulling his sidearm. We have to go to the basement. Now. We rushed toward the freight elevator, the emergency lights flickering as the power grid began to buckle under the strain of the forced override. We reached the basement levels, the air growing colder and smelling faintly of ozone and burnt plastic. As we stepped off the lift, the hallway was silent, too silent. I turned the corner toward the server room and stopped dead. The door was hanging off its hinges and the server racks were silent, their status lights dead. But standing in the center of the room wasn't the man from the feed. It was Marcus Thorne, his suit disheveled, his eyes wild and feverish. He held a small black remote in his hand, his thumb resting firmly on the trigger. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he hissed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You think you can just come into my world, use your fancy degrees to dismantle my legacy, and walk away with a promotion?" "It's over, Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I raised my hands. "There are no more offshore accounts. The boards have the files. You have nowhere left to go." He laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "You're right. There's nowhere left to go, which means none of us are leaving." He pressed the trigger, but nothing happened. He blinked, looking at the remote, then back at me. "Wait, why aren't you dead?" I didn't answer. I only noticed the blinking red light on my own phone, which I had synced to the building's emergency shutdown protocol the moment I sat in his chair. I hadn't just taken control of the data, I had jammed the signal to his detonator. He stared at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged at me, his fingers closing around my throat before Henderson could react. As I struggled to breathe, his face inches from mine, he whispered, "You might have stopped the blast, but you forgot one thing. The building isn't just full of servers. It's full of people. And if I go down, I'm taking everyone who helped you reach this far with me." Suddenly, the floor beneath us groaned, a deep, structural sound of twisting metal. Then, from somewhere deep in the foundation, I heard the sound of the emergency lockdown shutters slamming shut on the exits, trapping us all inside. I looked past him at the server room wall, and my blood ran cold. The wall wasn't just cracking, it was glowing. He hadn't just wired a detonator to the servers, he had wired it into the main gas lines that ran underneath the lobby. A timer appeared on the wall monitor, counting down from 60 seconds. He gripped my neck tighter, his voice a triumphant rasp. "You have 1 minute to choose, sweetheart. You can save yourself, or you can try to cut the gas lines while this place becomes a tomb. What's your legacy worth?" The air in the server room turned heavy, thick with the scent of leaking gas and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Every second that ticked away on the glowing red monitor felt like a hammer blow against my skull. Marcus's grip on my throat was suffocating, his eyes wide with a manic, hollow triumph. He knew that even if he didn't live to see the fallout, he had ensured that my victory would be written in rubble and ash. Henderson lunged forward, tackling Marcus with a force that sent us both sprawling across the cold concrete floor. The sudden release of pressure allowed me to gasp, air rushing into my burning lungs. But I didn't waste a second catching my breath. I scrambled toward the central terminal, my hands shaking so violently I could barely type. "Get him!" I screamed at Henderson, who was currently pinned under Marcus's desperate, frantic weight. Marcus was fighting with the strength of a cornered animal, his expensive suit tearing at the seams. "You can't stop it!" he shrieked, laughing as he clawed at Henderson's face. "The valve override is manual. You'd have to go into the sub-basement to shut it off, and those doors are already locked by the central security protocol. You're trapped in your own clever system." He was right. I checked the terminal. The manual override for the gas main was located in the sub-basement, 3 levels down. The doors were magnetically sealed, and with the building's power failing, the override triggers were dead. I had 38 seconds. My mind raced. I couldn't override the locks, but I could force a localized power surge to fry the magnetic coils. It would kill the power to the entire wing, effectively shutting down the building's emergency lighting and communication systems, but it would pop the seals on the doors. I looked at the terminal. It was a risky gamble. If the surge was too strong, it would cause the servers themselves to overheat and trigger a fire suppression system that used heavy, suffocating gas. "Henderson, sub-basement, move!" I shouted, slamming the execute key. The room plunged into darkness. A high-pitched whine echoed through the walls, the sound of thousands of volts being forced into the locking mechanism. Suddenly, a deafening thrum shook the floor, followed by the clanging of heavy steel doors swinging open in the distance. "Go!" I yelled again, but Henderson was still struggling with Marcus. I didn't wait. I grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and sprinted toward the door, not away from the danger, but toward it. I had to reach the manual valve. As I hit the hallway, the emergency lights flickered to a dim, sickly yellow. I could hear the hissing of the gas now, a faint, ominous sound coming from the ventilation shafts. 30 seconds. I reached the stairwell, my heart pounding in my ears like a war drum. I didn't care about the money anymore. I didn't care about the board members or the reputation of the firm. All that mattered was the realization that this man had been willing to sacrifice hundreds of lives just to spite me. As I descended the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around expecting Henderson, but it was Marcus. He had escaped the hold, his face a mess of blood and bruises, holding a heavy wrench he'd snatched from a utility cart. He looked like a ghost of the man who had mocked me in the lobby only hours ago. "You really thought you could play in my league?" he wheezed, his eyes darting toward the staircase railing. "I built this structure to be my fortress. If I can't have it, nobody can." He swung the wrench, and I ducked, the steel whistling inches from my ear, smashing into the concrete wall. I pivoted and swung the fire extinguisher, catching him in the chest. He stumbled, gasping, but he didn't fall. He was fueled by a pure, intoxicating rage that surpassed physical pain. 15 seconds, I screamed at him, hoping to shake his resolve. "If you don't stop this, you're going to burn with me. Is that what you want? To be remembered as a mass murderer instead of a mogul?" "I'll be remembered as the man who burned the world down because I was bored," he snarled, charging me again. I dove toward the sub-basement door, sliding across the slick floor. I saw the valve, a massive red iron wheel. I lunged for it, grabbing the spokes with both hands. It was rusted and stuck. I pulled, my muscles screaming, but it wouldn't budge. 10 seconds. Marcus was right behind me, his hand reaching out to grab my hair. I braced my back against the wall, put my feet against the valve, and pushed with everything I had left. The metal shrieked as it finally gave way. I felt the pressure shift, the rush of gas slowing, but it wasn't stopping completely. It was just slowing. 5 seconds. Marcus tackled me to the ground, his hands finding my throat again. "Too late," he hissed, his face twisted in a mask of triumph. I looked up at the ceiling, expecting the spark, the fire, the end of everything. But in the final second, the entire building groaned, a sickening, grinding sound of metal shearing. The floor beneath us tilted, just a fraction. The building didn't explode. Instead, the floor gave way. The sub-basement, which had been weakened by the structural sabotage Marcus had ordered months ago, collapsed. We tumbled downward into the dark, falling into the hidden crawl space beneath the foundation. As I hit the dirt and debris gasping for air, the last thing I heard was the sound of the main structure shifting above us. I pushed a piece of concrete off my legs, my breath hitching in my chest. I wasn't dead. I looked around the dark, dusty pit. Marcus was lying a few feet away, unconscious or worse. I fumbled for my phone in the dark, checking the screen. No signal. But then, the ground above us groaned again, and a sliver of light broke through the ceiling. I saw shadows moving. Someone was coming down. I grabbed a piece of jagged metal, pulling myself up, preparing for another fight. But the figure wasn't a guard. It was someone wearing a black mask, looking down into the pit with a cold, detached expression. "You really shouldn't have done that," the figure said, their voice altered by a digital modulator. "You were supposed to be the fall girl for the organized scheme. Now you're just a loose end." The figure raised something that glinted in the dim light, a pistol equipped with a suppressor. My heart stopped. It wasn't Marcus I had to worry about anymore. The organization he worked for had just arrived to clean up the mess, and I was the only witness left. The suppressor-equipped weapon was pointed directly at my chest, a small, dark circle that seemed to pull all the light out of the sub-basement. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, but my mind, the part of me that had spent years analyzing patterns and predicting human greed, suddenly turned ice cold. "You're not with the board," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the ringing in my ears. The figure laughed, a hollow, electronic sound. "The board is a collection of fossils who wouldn't know a hostile takeover if it hit them with a sledgehammer. You interfered with a legacy, Ms. Vaughn. A multi-billion-dollar machine doesn't just stop because a consultant discovers a few shell companies. If you shoot me, you lose the decryption key," I lied, keeping my hand hidden behind a slab of drywall. I wasn't holding a weapon. I was holding my phone, which was broadcasting a distress signal to the only person I trusted, my sister, a former investigative journalist who knew exactly how to track my location. I embedded the ledger within a logic bomb. If my vitals stop, the entire network, your names, your offshore routes, the connections to the local precinct, goes live to every major news outlet in the country. The figure hesitated. That flicker of uncertainty was the window I needed. "You're bluffing," the shadow spat, though the muzzle dipped just a fraction of an inch. "You're an analyst. You don't have the stomach for blackmail." "I'm the woman who just dismantled a Titan in under 6 hours, I retorted, locking eyes with the masked intruder. "Do you really want to bet your entire existence on whether or not I'm a gambler?" In that split second of hesitation, Marcus groaned, shifting in the rubble behind me. The figure's attention flicked toward him, a fatal lapse in focus. I lunged. I didn't go for the gun. I grabbed the heavy flashlight that had rolled into the pit during the collapse and hurled it with every ounce of my remaining strength toward the support beam next to the intruder. The impact caused a chain reaction. The beam, already strained by the structural collapse of the floors above, buckled. A cascade of rebar and concrete poured down like a waterfall of stone, separating me from the gunman. The sound was deafening. Dust choked the air, turning the world into a gray, suffocating void. I scrambled backward, grabbing Marcus by the back of his collar and dragging him toward the only exit I could see, a drainage pipe that led toward the storm sewers. "Wake up, you pathetic coward," I hissed, slapping his face. Marcus blinked, his eyes unfocused, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "You," he rasped, "you're dead. They won't let you leave." "I'm leaving," I said, shoving him into the darkness of the pipe. "And you're coming with me, because you're going to be the one who tells them exactly who signed your paychecks." We crawled through the muck, the air growing fouler with every yard. Behind us, I heard heavy boots hitting the concrete, the sound of organized men moving with lethal efficiency. They weren't just looking for me, they were hunting me. We emerged into a storm sewer junction, the ceiling high and vaulted. The water was shallow but ice cold. I pulled Marcus to his feet, ignoring his wails of protest. I had no idea where I was, only that I was underneath the city's financial district. Suddenly, a red laser dot danced across the wall ahead of us. "There!" a voice echoed through the tunnel, deep and calm. "Kill the girl. Bring the man back. He still has the biometric keys for the secondary cache." They weren't here to eliminate Marcus. They needed him, and I was just a witness to be erased. I looked at Marcus. For the first time, he looked truly terrified. Not of me, but of the people he had served. "They're going to kill me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They told me I was their golden boy. They promised me protection." "You were never a partner, Marcus," I said, my voice harsh. "You were just an asset, and assets have a shelf life." I pulled out my phone one last time. The signal was a single, flickering bar. I didn't send a message to the news. I sent a trigger to the building's internal alarm system, causing it to override the city's municipal power grid. Outside, the entire block would go dark, sirens would wail, and the chaos would be the only cover we had to reach the surface. "Run," I commanded. We bolted, splashing through the sewage, the sound of gunfire ricocheting off the damp walls behind us. Bullets hissed through the air, clipping the concrete and spraying us with razor-sharp debris. We reached a maintenance ladder, and I pushed Marcus toward it. "Go!" He scrambled up, but just as I reached for the rungs, a heavy boot slammed into my shoulder, knocking me back into the water. I looked up, face to face with the man in the mask. He reached down, grabbing my hair and pulling my head above the murky water. "End of the line," he said, drawing his weapon. I smiled, though my face was a mask of grime and pain. "You forgot one thing." "And what's that?" he sneered. I pointed toward the water at his feet. A bright, pulsing blue light was floating there. My phone. I had set a timer for the building's fire suppression system, but I hadn't set it for the servers. I had set it for the gas main I had partially shut off. "The gas didn't stop," I whispered. "It just built up pressure in the secondary pipes, and you're standing right on top of the main vent." The floorboards of the sewer maintenance level groaned as a massive hiss of pressure erupted from below. The gunman looked down, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. The explosion didn't destroy the city, but it was enough to turn the tunnel into a furnace of pressurized steam. The blast threw us both into the darkness. As I tumbled through the churning water, hit by the force of the steam and debris, I saw a hand reaching out from the shadows of the tunnel ahead. It wasn't the gunman. It wasn't Marcus. It was a woman in a dark trench coat, holding an open door to a waiting transport van. "Get in," she snapped, her face obscured by a hat. "You have exactly 10 seconds before they realize you didn't die in the basement." I crawled toward her, gasping for breath, but as I reached the threshold, I stopped. I saw the emblem on the van, the same logo that was on the hidden folder in Marcus's safe. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice a broken rasp. She pulled back her hat, revealing a face that looked almost exactly like mine, but aged, hardened, and marked by a long, jagged scar across her cheek. She pointed to a man standing in the driver's seat. It was my father, the man who had disappeared 20 years ago, the man who was supposed to be dead. "We aren't the ones you need to worry about," she said, her voice chillingly familiar. "We're the ones who founded the group that Marcus just handed your name to, and now we're going to show you exactly why you are the only one they were afraid of." The rain began to fall in the city, washing the soot of the night from the pavement, but inside the sterile, dimly lit interior of the van, the air felt frozen. I stared at my father, a man whose funeral I had attended 2 decades ago, and then at the woman, my mother, who was supposed to have been gone just as long. They were not the ghosts I had mourned. They were the architects of the very nightmare I had spent my life trying to outrun. "The files," my mother said, her voice devoid of maternal warmth, cold as a winter wind. "You found the ones regarding the internal security structure. You realized the organized scheme was not just a side project of Marcus, but the foundation of our family's influence." I felt a surge of bile rise in my throat. Everything I had worked for, the consultancy, the audit, the attempt to tear down a corrupt system, wasn't a crusade against an outsider. It was a war against my own legacy. Marcus Thorne wasn't the mastermind. He was just a puppet, and I was the heir apparent they had been testing all along. "You let him play with those people?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and betrayal. "You let him put hundreds of people in danger. You let him try to blow up a building, just to see if I could stop him? This was a test?" My father sighed, a tired, heavy sound. "The world is run by people who think they are strong because they own assets. We own the people who own the assets. We needed to know if you had the ruthlessness to take over the network without hesitation. You didn't just dismantle the scheme, daughter. You optimized it. You proved that your intellect is worth more than all of Marcus's billions combined." The van pulled into a secure underground bay. I looked at the exit, then at the 2 people who had shaped my DNA and my trauma. For years, I had believed that my success was a triumph of hard work over systemic barriers. Now I realized my entire career had been a carefully orchestrated sandbox designed by them to groom me for a throne I never wanted. "I'm not staying," I said, my voice low and resolute. My father reached into his pocket, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a tablet. He slid it across the console. It showed my personal bank accounts, my digital identity, and every record of my life. They were all gone. In their place was a new identity, a blank slate, and a set of keys to a private account that held enough capital to change the world. Not through control, but through the systematic dismantling of their influence. If you walk away, my mother said, you lose everything. You become a non-person. If you stay, you own the board, you own the network, and you can destroy it from the inside, piece by piece. But you must become what you hate to erase what they have built. I looked at the screen. The choice was a razor's edge. I could run, fade into the shadows, and live in constant fear of their reach, or I could take the keys to the kingdom and burn it down, starting with the very people who thought I was their creation. I looked at Marcus, who was slumped in the corner of the van, his spirit shattered, his arrogance replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He was a cautionary tale of what happened to those who served them without understanding the price. I took the tablet. I'm not doing this for you, I said, meeting my mother's eyes, and I'm not doing this for a legacy. I started typing, not to accept the position, but to execute the final command of the algorithm I had spent months writing. It wasn't a bypass. It was a total system collapse. I had hidden the kill switch in the server migration files I'd uploaded earlier that night. Every financial route, every offshore account, and every piece of evidence of their organized scheme was being broadcasted to the national financial oversight agencies and the media simultaneously. The van lurched as the building's power grid finally surrendered to the overload. Alarms began to blare, and the emergency lights flashed red. "What have you done?" my father shouted, reaching for the tablet, but I had already encrypted the access points. "I told you," I said, a smile finally touching my lips. "I'm not a rounding error. I'm the end of the line." I opened the van door before they could react and leaped out into the rain-slicked alleyway. Behind me, the van's alarms joined the chorus of the city. I didn't look back as I disappeared into the labyrinthine streets of the city, my phone chiming with notification after notification. Proof that the truth was spreading. The accounts were being frozen, and the empire that had sought to claim me was falling under the weight of its own hubris. 6 months later, I sat on a terrace overlooking a quiet, nameless bay, thousands of miles from the steel and glass of the city. My face had changed. My name was a secret, and the life I had known was a memory, buried under the wreckage of the Sterling Vance headquarters. I read the morning news on a paper that wouldn't track my digital footprint. The headlines were a beautiful, chaotic mess. The fall of the billionaires, massive corruption scheme uncovered, the end of the Thorne legacy. The arrogant billionaire who had once mocked me in the lobby was currently serving a massive sentence in a high-security facility, his name synonymous with disgrace. My parents had disappeared into the shadows, their influence evaporated along with their wealth. They had tried to build a monster to protect their legacy, but they had forgotten that monsters, if trained well enough, eventually learn who to hunt. I set the paper down and watched the sunrise. I didn't have the triple salary lifestyle anymore. I didn't have the power or the penthouse. But for the first time in my life, I had the one thing they could never buy, steal, or force me to relinquish. The absolute untouchable freedom of a woman who had burned her own path to the ground, just to see what would grow in the ashes. I wasn't just a survivor, I was the architect of my own destiny. And as the sun climbed above the horizon, I knew that no one would ever mock me again. Not because of what I had, but because of what I had proven I could destroy.